Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the pitch-black metallic nightmare of the High Middle Ages, a time when a specific class of elite warriors was pushed to the absolute brink of psychological ruin. Imagine being encased in a heavy, freezing cage of iron, your vision reduced to a tiny slit, while the world around you explodes into a chaotic symphony of screaming men, thrashing horses and shattering wood. You probably won't survive this, honestly. Because before you even face an enemy blade, your own gear is actively trying to crush your spirit and break your mind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your current location and local time down in the comments below. I always love seeing where in the world you're listening from as the night settles in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in the muddy grass of a French field in the early 15th century. Your breathing is shallow, coming in ragged rhythmic gasps that immediately fog up the narrow eye slits of your steel sallet helmet. Mainstream military historians point out that a full suit of late medieval articulated plate armour weighed anywhere from 45 to 55 pounds, meticulously distributed across the entire body using a complex system of leather straps, internal padded doublets, and rivets. This wasn't just clothing, it was an entire engineered ecosystem designed to turn you into an impenetrable tank. But as you stand here waiting for the advance horn, that beautifully polished masterpiece of metallurgy begins to feel like a mobile coffin. Every step requires a deliberate, exhausting expenditure of energy. The straps bite into your shoulders, the heavy pauldrons compress your chest, and the iron greaves on your shins turn your legs into lead weights. It is an overwhelming sensation of physical confinement that completely detaches you from the outside world. The sheer physical pressure of this metal shell does strange things to your brain over long hours of waiting. A quirky, fringe tidbit from historical armourers reveals that knights would occasionally suffer from sudden, paralysing panic attacks right before a battle, forcing their squires to frantically unbolt their helmets using specialised wrenches just so the warrior wouldn't choke on their own vomit or pass out from sudden hyperventilation. Imagine paying a small fortune for a custom-tailored suit of steel, only to have it give you an intense bout of claustrophobia before you even see a single enemy flag. You try to adjust your posture, but the iron gauntlets turn your fingers into clumsy, unfeeling tools. You're completely trapped inside your own defense system, a silent prisoner to the very metal that is supposed to keep you alive. This constant, heavy confinement has fueled decades of intense debate among modern medievalists. Historians still argue whether the extreme physical weight and resulting claustrophobia of plate armour was a primary catalyst for sudden, erratic psychological breaks on the battlefield, or if the knights were so thoroughly conditioned from early childhood training that they viewed the metal shell as a comforting, protective second skin rather than an oppressive cage. For you, standing here in the damp fog, the comfort is nowhere to be found. The constant downward pull on your collarbones creates a dull, throbbing ache that creeps up the back of your neck and settles right behind your eyes. Every movement produces a sharp, metallic screech that vibrates directly into your skull, a relentless reminder that you are locked away inside an unyielding iron vault. You can feel the sweat beginning to pool underneath your thick wool gambeson, the padded undergarment that prevents the cold steel from chafing your skin raw. The fabric is already damp from your anxious perspiration, clinging to your torso like a cold, wet rag. You want nothing more than to reach up and scratch your nose or wipe the sweat out of your eyes, but the heavy steel vambraces on your arms make such a simple human gesture utterly impossible. You are forced to just stand there, enduring the tiny, agonizing tortures of your own anatomy, while the weight of the world settles squarely on your ironclad shoulders, waiting for the signal that will plunge your claustrophobic world into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The damp fog of the morning eventually burns away, but it offers absolutely no relief. Instead, the midday sun transforms your iron suit into a makeshift oven. Mainstream medical historians have documented that the internal temperature of a knight wearing a padded gambeson, chainmail, and external plate armour during active combat could easily skyrocket past 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius, triggering immediate heat exhaustion, severe electrolyte depletion, and rapid dehydration. You're essentially trapped in an engineered microclimate that cooks your muscles from the outside in. Every breath you draw inside that closed helm feels like inhaling hot soup. Your tongue feels thick, dry, and entirely too large for your mouth, covered in a sticky film of dust and concentrated saliva. As you trudge forward across the uneven field, your heart hammers violently against your ribs like a trapped bird. A quirky fringe tidbit from the annals of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 reveals that several elite avant-garde knights actually died on the field without a single wound on their bodies. They simply collapsed into the deep mud and suffocated or suffered massive heat strokes because the absolute lack of ventilation inside their high-end armour prevented their bodies from cooling down. Imagine training for 15 years in the arts of chivalry, swordplay and equestrian combat, only to be taken out by a particularly warm Tuesday and a lack of a built-in fan. You try to swallow, but your throat feels like sandpaper, and the metallic tang of the hot iron visor mixes with the copper taste of your own mounting panic. The psychological weight of this inescapable heat adds a dangerous layer of desperation to your thoughts. Historians still argue whether the extreme dehydration experienced by Crusader knights in arid territories directly caused widespread collective delirium that was mistaken for divine religious visions, or if the sheer physical trauma of heat stroke simply induced permanent, localized brain damage among the elite military class. In your case, the heat makes the edges of your narrow vision begin to swim with dark, pulsing spots. The landscape loses its sharp reality, shimmering in the heat distortion passing through your eye slits. You're no longer just fighting an opposing army, you're locked in a mortal struggle against your own rising core temperature, completely aware that popping your helmet open for a quick breeze could result in a stray arrow instantly ending your career. The sweat is no longer just pooling, it is actively running down your forehead in thick, stinging rivulets that blind your eyes. Because your heavy gauntlets prevent you from wiping your face, you're forced to blink frantically, your eyes burning from the salt. The thick wool padding beneath your breastplate expands as it absorbs gallons of your perspiration, growing heavier and smelling increasingly foul. The metallic cage around you grows hotter by the minute, absorbing the unrelenting radiation of the sun and radiating it directly into your skin. You feel an overwhelming claustrophobic urge to rip the metal plates from your chest with your bare hands, a rising hysteria that screams at you that you're being buried alive in a burning metal coffin. The blinding heat inside your armour is bad enough, but as the enemy advance begins, the world around you suddenly shrinks into a terrifying, silent void. Mainstream sensory historians emphasize that medieval helmets, particularly the heavy great helms and visored bassinets of the 14th and 15th centuries, severely restricted a warrior's peripheral vision and reduced their hearing by up to 70%. When you snap your visor down, the wide, panoramic landscape of the valley is instantly obliterated. Your entire universe is reduced to a horizontal slit less than an inch wide. You can no longer see your feet, you cannot see who is standing directly to your left or right, and the absolute isolation turns your mind into a hyper-paranoid echo chamber where your own frantic breathing sounds like a roaring engine. Every sound inside that steel bucket is amplified to an unnatural, agonizing degree. A quirky, fringe tidbit from historical weapon trials shows that a direct mace or sword blow to a knight's helmet didn't always need to crack the steel to kill. The kinetic impact generated an acoustic shockwave inside the helm, reaching over 120 decibels, effectively rupturing the wearer's eardrums and causing instantaneous, severe concussions accompanied by permanent vertigo. Imagine standing in the middle of a chaotic melee while a persistent, deafening ringing sound fills your head, completely erasing your sense of balance and leaving you spinning like a broken top. Every time a stray arrow glances off your skull, it sounds like an iron church bell swinging directly against your ear. This sensory deprivation combined with acoustic trauma creates a profound state of cognitive dissociation. Historians still argue whether the chaotic, muffled audio environment of the helmet drove knights into a state of hysterical sensory deprivation that triggered vivid auditory hallucinations, or if the sheer physical isolation simply forced these men to rely entirely on muscle memory and blind survival instincts, effectively shutting down their higher brain functions during combat. As you stumble forward through the churned earth, you feel completely disconnected from your own body. You hear the muffled, low-frequency thud of horses galloping somewhere nearby, but you cannot tell from which direction they are charging. The terrifying ambiguity makes you want to swing your sword wildly at the empty air. Your ears throb with a dull, heavy ache from the internal pressure of your own pulse racing at maximum speed. The air inside the helmet grows increasingly foul and carbon dioxide heavy, making your head spin with a light, dizzying fog. You can hear the distant, underwater-sounding screams of wounded men, but without peripheral vision, your brain automatically populates the blind spots with imaginary horrors. You're convinced someone is standing right behind you with an axe, but turning your entire body around in 50 pounds of metal takes a slow, agonizing effort. The steel walls of your helm feel like they are closing in, transforming the grand theatre of medieval warfare into a private, suffocating chamber of absolute auditory and visual terror. The psychological pressure inside your iron helmet is already pushing you to the edge, but the true threat to your sanity didn't come from an enemy blade or a hot afternoon, it came from breakfast. Mainstream agricultural and medical historians point out that medieval armies relied heavily on rye bread as a primary ration, a crop that was notoriously susceptible to Claviceps purpurea, a toxic fungus that causes ergot poisoning, or St. Anthony's fire. When ingested, this parasitic fungus unleashes a cocktail of powerful alkaloids chemically related to modern LSD. You didn't realize that the hard, dark crusts you wolfed down in the pre-dawn mist were thoroughly laced with a psychoactive toxin capable of causing violent muscle spasms, gangrene, and severe, terrifying hallucinations. As you march in formation, the damp mud beneath your feet suddenly begins to shift and writhe like a carpet of living serpents. A quirky, fringe tidbit from historical toxicological studies notes that ergotism outbreaks in military camps often led to bizarre, localized instances of mass hysteria, where entire garrisons of battle-hardened men became convinced that their own limbs were burning with an invisible, hellish fire, or that their comrades had been replaced by shape-shifting demons. Remember that thick, suffocating fog inside your helmet from earlier? Now, that dark slit of a visor isn't just filtering reality, it is projecting a waking nightmare. You look at the knight marching beside you, but his polished steel pauldron looks like a leering metallic face, its rivets blinking like cold, unblinking eyes. This toxic chemical fracturing of reality introduces an incredible layer of confusion to the period. Historians still argue whether some of the most bizarre, seemingly suicidal charges executed by medieval knights were actually driven by strategic incompetence and stubborn pride, or if entire vanguard units were simply tripping on psychedelic rye mold, charging blindly into enemy lines to escape the invisible monsters chasing them in their own minds. For you, the battlefield is transformed into a surreal landscape, where the sky looks a bruised, terrifying shade of purple, and the distant blare of the war horns sounds like the distorted wailing of damned souls. You try to shake your head to clear the vision, but the ergot alkaloids have a tight chemical grip on your central nervous system. Your fingers twitch uncontrollably inside your iron gauntlets, a cold numbness creeping up your forearms as the vasoconstrictive properties of the poison restrict blood flow to your extremities. The physical sensation of freezing mixed with the psychological terror of the hallucinations creates an agonizing state of double reality. You cannot trust your eyes, you cannot trust your ears, and you certainly cannot trust the tactical orders being yelled by your commander. Every shadow looks like an incoming weapon, and every rustle of the wind sounds like a demonic whisper telling you that your armor is melting directly into your flesh, dragging you down into a private, chemically induced hell from which you cannot escape. The chemical madness swirling in your veins from the poisoned rye bread eventually begins to subside, but it leaves you exposed to an even deeper, more permanent psychological fracture. You are a Christian warrior, trapped in a vice-like trap of impossible contradictions. Mainstream cultural historians emphasize that the medieval code of chivalry demanded an absolute agonizing paradox. A knight was expected to be a ruthless, efficient engine of battlefield slaughter, capable of cleaving men in half with a broadsword, while simultaneously remaining a pious, humble, and gentle servant of a Christ who preached absolute nonviolence and turning the other cheek. This wasn't just a lifestyle choice. It was a constant tearing strain on your very soul that threatened you with eternal damnation every time you did your job. As you stand over the crumpled form of a young squire you just bested in the mud, your hands shake violently beneath your iron plates. A quirky fringe tidbit from early medieval penitential texts reveals that after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the Catholic Church actually imposed strict, mandatory periods of public penance and fasting on the victorious Norman knights, decreeing that for every single man a knight had killed on the battlefield, he had to perform 40 days of grueling spiritual penance to cleanse his soul of the sin of murder. Imagine surviving a horrific, chaotic bloodbath through sheer luck and martial skill, only to return home and be told by your priest that your reward for defending your king is a year of starvation and public shaming, because God is deeply offended by your tactical success. This deep spiritual dissonance has sparked intense analysis among modern psychological historians. Historians still argue whether medieval knights suffered from a distinct, culturally specific variant of post-traumatic stress disorder, driven by this intense religious guilt, or if the constant performance of ritual confessions and church-mandated penance acted as a highly effective, primitive form of group therapy that successfully purged their combat trauma before it could curdle into permanent insanity. For you, the therapy isn't working. Every time you close your eyes inside that dark helmet, you don't see the glory of your lineage. You see the terrified face of the teenager you ran through with your lance, his blood splashing across your beautifully polished steel armor. The stress of balancing these two incompatible identities manifests as a heavy physical weight in your chest, far heavier than your 50-pound breastplate. You're told that your violence is holy, that your crusade is blessed by the Pope himself, but the basic human empathy buried deep within your brain rejects the justification. The fear of hellfire becomes a tangible, terrifying reality that haunts your sleeping hours, transforming every shadow in your tent into a clutching demon, waiting to drag your soul down to the pit. You're caught in a permanent crossfire between the demands of your warlord and the demands of your god, a mental tightrope walk that slowly, systematically unravels your sanity until you can no longer distinguish between a holy crusade and a senseless, horrific slaughter. The psychological torture of your spiritual crisis follows you off the field and straight into the filthy, chaotic expanse of the military encampment. Mainstream logistical historians point out that medieval military campaigns were long, agonizing stretches of grinding boredom punctuated by brief flashes of terror, where soldiers spent up to 90% of their time trapped in damp, overcrowded tents pitched in poorly drained fields. The grand, colourful pavilions of popular romance are a myth. Your reality is a leaky linen shelter shared with 6 other sweating, unwashed men. The ground beneath your thin straw bedding is a soup of mud and horse manure, and the constant dampness creeps upward, soaking through your wool cloaks and ensuring that your bones ache with a deep, arthritic chill before you even close your eyes. Sleep is a luxury you simply cannot afford in this environment. A quirky, fringe tidbit from historical military hygiene records shows that a knight's heavily padded undergarments, which were rarely washed to avoid rotting the natural fibres, became thriving ecosystems for body lice, scabies mites, and fleas. The intense, maddening itch of thousands of microscopic parasites crawling beneath your skin while you are tightly strapped into 50 pounds of unyielding iron plate during the day can literally drive a person to the brink of a screaming fit. Remember that burning desire to scratch your face inside your helmet. Multiply that by your entire torso, trapped under a heavy iron breastplate that requires a squire and 3 specialized tools just to unbolt. This chronic sleep deprivation, combined with constant physical discomfort, creates a profound mental unraveling. Historians still argue whether the erratic, hyper-violent behavior of certain knightly orders during long campaigns was a result of tactical breakdown, or if it was simply a collective psychosis brought on by months of severe, cumulative sleep debt that completely destroyed their impulse control and executive functioning. As you lay awake in the dark, listening to the synchronized coughing of 10,000 men and the distant, eerie howling of camp-following wolves, your brain begins to misinterpret the sounds. Every snap of a nearby campfire sounds like an incoming crossbow bolt, and the gentle rustling of the tent flap transforms into the stealthy approach of an assassin. Your nervous system is trapped in a permanent state of high alert, flooded with a non-stop stream of adrenaline that has nowhere to go. The exhaustion leaves your mind completely raw, stripping away the thin veneer of chivalric discipline and leaving behind a volatile, hyper-aggressive survivor. You find yourself picking violent fights with your close squires over a misplaced strap or a slightly burnt piece of salted pork, The camp is not a place of rest. It is a psychological pressure cooker where damp cold, parasitic torment, and the heavy, suffocating fear of a midnight raid slowly grind your sanity down to a fine, volatile powder. The grinding misery of the military camp eventually leads to a return to courtly life, but the castles of the high nobility offer a different, far more insidious kind of psychological poison. Mainstream art and social historians point out that the medieval upper classes were utterly obsessed with vivid, ostentatious colours as a direct display of immense wealth, leading to the widespread use of highly toxic mineral pigments and heavy metal fixatives in everything from the brilliant tapestries hanging on damp stone walls to the luxury cosmetics applied by the elite. As a knight of status, you are expected to look the part during grand feasts, coating your face in fashionable lead-based white creams and wearing robes saturated with lethal chemicals. You are literally marinating your central nervous system in heavy metals to maintain your social standing. The physical and neurological consequences of this aristocratic vanity are devastating over time. A quirky, fringe tidbit from historical textiles research reveals that one of the most prestigious fabric dyes of the era, a brilliant deep scarlet red reserved for high-ranking nobility and elite knightly orders, was frequently stabilized using massive quantities of liquid mercury and arsenic compounds. Remember those beautifully dyed wool doublets you wore beneath your armor to prevent chafing? When you sweat profusely inside that hot iron oven during a battle, the moisture leaches the mercury right out of the red fabric, allowing it to be absorbed directly into your wide-open pores. Imagine your own luxury uniform slowly dripping a potent neurotoxin straight into your bloodstream every single time you go for a brisk ride. This systemic chemical poisoning adds a layer of biological madness to the historical record. Historians still argue whether the legendary, sudden personality shifts seen in many aging medieval warlords, characterized by unprovoked fits of homicidal rage, severe tremors, and intense paranoia, were the natural psychological results of a lifetime of brutal combat trauma, or if these men were simply suffering from advanced mercury poisoning contracted through their high-end wardrobe choices. For you, the heavy metal toxicity manifests as a persistent fine tremor in your hands that makes holding a goblet an embarrassing ordeal. Your moods swing wildly like a swinging broadsword. One minute you're weeping tears of profound religious devotion, and the next you are drawing your dagger because a servant brought you a slightly cool bowl of venison broth. Your teeth begin to loosen in your gums, and a constant metallic tang fills your mouth, completely overriding the taste of your expensive wine. The toxic load on your brain creates a dark, impenetrable fog that mimics the sensory isolation of your closed iron helmet. You find yourself forgetting the names of your own squires and losing your way in the familiar corridors of your ancestral estate. The very symbols of your elite status, the brilliant red robes, the white face powders, the beautifully illuminated manuscripts coated in toxic cinnabar paint, are acting as a silent, invisible executioner, systematically destroying the delicate neural pathways of your brain until your reality becomes a fragmented, terrifying maze of paranoia and unprovoked aggression. The chemical fog of mercury and lead in your bloodstream makes your head spin, but when your mind finally snaps under the strain of a minor battlefield wound, you are subjected to the absolute pinnacle of medieval medical horror. Mainstream medical historians emphasize that the dominant paradigm of healthcare in Europe was the theory of humorism, which dictated that all physical ailments and psychological disorders were caused by an imbalance of 4 basic bodily fluids: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. If a knight returned from a campaign showing signs of severe combat fatigue, erratic panic attacks, or unprovoked weeping, the local physician didn't offer a quiet room and a listening ear. They concluded that your brain was literally boiling with an excess of hot, angry blood, and the only logical cure was to drain that vital fluid out of your body until you became compliant. You're strapped down to a heavy wooden bench in a dimly lit chamber that smells of stale vinegar and dried gore. A quirky, fringe tidbit from medieval barber surgeon manuals reveals that for psychological agitation, doctors would often apply dozens of starved medicinal leeches directly to the patient's temples and the base of the skull, believing that draining blood directly from the head would instantly cool the frantic, overheated animal spirits lurking inside the brain. Remember that terrible ringing in your ears from the acoustic shockwaves inside your helmet. Now add the cold, slimy sensation of multiple segmented worms anchoring themselves to your forehead, swelling to 3 times their size as they drink your life force, while a man in a stained robe chants Latin prayers over your shivering body. This brutal approach to mental health has fueled intense debates among modern historians of science. Historians still argue whether medieval bloodletting occasionally provided an accidental psychosomatic placebo effect that calmed hysterical patients through sheer physical exhaustion, or if the massive loss of blood simply induced acute anemia and oxygen deprivation in the brain, effectively starving the traumatized soldiers of the energy required to exhibit symptoms of their underlying psychosis. In your case, the bloodletting leaves you completely hollowed out. Your skin turns a ghastly pale shade of grey, and your muscles feel as weak as water. You are too exhausted to scream, too weak to fight, and too dizzy to even remember what horrified you in the first place. The physician stands back, admiring his work as he wipes his brass basin, entirely convinced that your newly acquired catatonic silence is proof of a successful psychiatric cure. But your mind is in a deeper state of fracture than ever before. Your nervous system, already battered by ergot, mercury, and chronic sleep deprivation, has now been physically starved of oxygen. As you lay there shivering on the blood-soaked straw, the room begins to tilt and spin. The shadows on the stone walls morph into twisting predatory shapes that the physician insists are just the bad humours escaping your flesh, leaving you completely isolated in a weakened, bloodless twilight zone of absolute vulnerability and quiet, unmedicated madness. The weakness of the bloodletting room slowly fades, but your mind remains trapped on the field of slaughter long after the physical campaign has ended. Mainstream social and military historians recognize that medieval soldiers returned to civilian life carrying immense psychological scars, frequently reliving the horrors of close-quarters combat through what we now classify as severe post-traumatic stress. For a knight, there is no transitioning back to a peaceful agrarian life. You live in a society that constantly glorifies the very violence that broke you. Every slammed castle door sounds like the shattering of an enemy shield, and the sudden screech of a hunting hawk overhead sends your hand flying toward a phantom sword hilt before you even realize you're standing safely in your own courtyard. The world around you populates itself with terrifying sensory echoes. A quirky, fringe tidbit from medieval spiritual diaries reveals that old warriors often claimed to see the restless spirits of the men they had killed standing at the foot of their beds at night, or would wake up screaming that they could smell the distinct sweet stench of gangrenous flesh and ruptured bowels inside a pristine chapel. Remember that suffocating hot air inside your closed helmet from the noonday charge? Now you experience sudden phantom suffocations while sitting at a lavish feast, your throat closing up as you become convinced that the high stone walls of the banquet hall are closing in to crush you like an iron visor. This tragic haunting of the veteran class remains an active arena of academic study. Historians still argue whether the high frequency of knights abandoning their lands to permanently join cloistered, silent monastic orders was driven by genuine, late-life religious piety, or if these men were simply seeking a desperate psychological asylum from the ghostly flashbacks and intrusive memories that made secular life entirely unendurable. For you, the ghosts are relentless. You can be walking through a quiet orchard, watching the peaceful autumn leaves fall, and suddenly the red tint of a maple leaf transforms into a vivid flashback of the blood spray that coated your gauntlets when you ran down an archer in the mud. Your family looks at you with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror. You're a celebrated hero of the realm, yet you sit in the corner of the great hall for hours, staring blankly into the hearth fire with a cold, unblinking gaze that the servants whisper is the mark of a cursed soul. The line between the living and the dead has completely blurred in your mind. The battlefield is no longer a geographical location you left behind in France or the Levant. It is a permanent geographical fixture of your internal landscape, a ghostly theatre that plays on an endless, agonizing loop behind your eyelids every single time you try to close your eyes to sleep. The ghostly echoes of the battlefield do not just isolate you in quiet corners. Sometimes, the sheer psychological pressure of survival and unconfessed terror links up with the minds of your comrades, erupting into a terrifying display of mass psychogenic illness. Mainstream sociologists and medical historians have long documented the phenomenon of mass hysteria during the late medieval period, a time when communities broken by famine, endless warfare, and religious anxiety would suddenly succumb to uncontrollable physical impulses. When you return to the massive staging camps near the border, you find a garrison that has completely abandoned its post, not to desert, but to engage in a frantic, involuntary physical ritual that defies all military logic. You watch in absolute disbelief as dozens of battle-hardened men, still wearing parts of their heavy iron gear, begin to twitch, shake, and throw themselves into a wild, rhythmic dance in the centre of the camp. A quirky, fringe tidbit from historical chronicles of these dancing plagues, such as the famous outbreaks that swept through Europe, reveals that affected individuals would scream out that they were seeing the heavens open up, or that they were drowning in rivers of blood, dancing non-stop for days at a time until their feet bled through their leather boots and their hearts literally burst from sheer physical exhaustion. Remember that terrifying feeling of your heart hammering like a trapped bird inside your hot breastplate? Now, imagine that same frantic rhythm hijacking your legs, forcing you to hop, spin, and stomp in the hot sun while your mind screams at you to stop. This collective somatic explosion has sparked endless investigation among modern researchers. Historians still argue whether the dancing plague was a biological reaction to a localized secondary wave of ergot poisoning from contaminated campflower, or if it was a pure stress-induced dissociative state, where the human brain, utterly crushed by the terror of impending battle and the guilt of past murders, simply turned off its higher functions and looked for an involuntary physical escape valve to release the psychological pressure. As you step closer to the writhing crowd, the infectious nature of the hysteria begins to tug at your own raw nerves. The rhythmic, frantic stomping of unbooted feet on the packed earth matches the fast, anxious throb of your own pulse. You feel a sudden, terrifying twitch in your left calf. Your arms, heavy from years of carrying a broadsword, begin to swing rhythmically at your sides against your own will. The exhaustion that has built up in your bones from months of sleepless nights in damp trenches vanishes, replaced by a frantic, hysterical burst of nervous energy. Your vision narrows down to that same horizontal slit you experienced inside your closed helm, and before you can cry out to your squire for help, you find yourself leaping into the centre of the circle, joining the ranks of the damned as you dance yourself into absolute frothing oblivion under the unblinking eye of the summer sun. The wild, rhythmic convulsions of the dancing plague leave your body battered and your nerves entirely frayed, prompting you to seek a radical spiritual cleanse to regain control of your fractured mind. Mainstream medieval religious historians point out that elite warriors often turn to extreme asceticism as a way to conquer the flesh, practicing severe self-starvation, or holy anorexia, in a desperate bid to purge their sins and achieve pristine prophetic clarity. You decide that the only way to silence the screaming ghosts in your head and wash away the toxic guilt of the battlefield is to deny your body everything it craves, reducing your daily intake to nothing more than water and a few crumbs of stale communion bread. As the weeks of starvation drag on, your physical form begins to waste away inside your ancestral stone manor. A quirky, fringe tidbit from monastic and knightly diaries reveals that prolonged fasting would cause a knight's body to enter an advanced state of ketosis and severe nutrient deficiency, inducing vivid auditory and visual hallucinations that the starving men regularly misinterpreted as holy visitations from saints, angels, or the Virgin Mary herself. Remember that leering, metallic face you saw on your comrade's pauldron during your ergot trip? Now, without any chemicals at all, the dark shadows of your private chapel begin to warp into blinding, glowing figures that step out from the painted altar to whisper cryptic prophecies directly into your ears. This self-inflicted cognitive decline has generated substantial controversy among modern medical historians. Historians still argue whether the extreme fasting practice by the military elite was a culturally sanctioned method of inducing safe, visionary states to cope with untamed combat trauma, or if it was simply a lethal manifestation of clinical depression and self-punishment that permanently damaged the brain tissue and executive functioning of the realm's top defenders. For you, the starvation does not bring holy peace. It brings an icy, intellectual detachment from reality. Your skin clings tightly to your cheekbones, your hair begins to fall out in patches, and your thoughts move with a slow, agonizing sluggishness that makes simple conversation impossible. You spend hours kneeling on the freezing stone floor, your emaciated knees bruising against the rock, staring at a crucifix with wide, unblinking eyes. The lack of glucose in your brain makes the world outside your chapel window feel incredibly distant and entirely artificial, as if you are looking through that tiny, suffocating eye slit of your helmet once again. You're convinced that your hunger is a holy fire consuming your mortal corruption, but in reality your mind is simply starving to death, floating away into a hazy, delusional twilight where the line between religious ecstasy and profound, irreversible cognitive ruin has vanished entirely. The fragile twilight of your spiritual starvation is suddenly shattered by a terror that sweeps through the land faster than any invading cavalry. Mainstream epidemiological historians have documented the terrifying breakouts of the English sweating sickness, or pseudoanglicus, a mysterious and highly lethal illness that emerged in the late 15th century, targeting young, wealthy men and elite garrisons with terrifying precision. Unlike the slow, creeping rot of the famine-born plagues, this disease is an absolute sprint toward the grave. It strikes without warning. A man could be perfectly healthy at breakfast, laughing with his squires, and be a cold, stiff corpse by the time the evening candles are lit. The immediate symptom of the affliction is a sudden, unnatural horror that grips your mind before your body even begins to fail. A quirky fringe tidbit from contemporary medical accounts reveals that the sweating sickness was unique because its very first clinical sign was a sudden, overwhelming wave of existential dread and unprovoked panic, causing battle-hardened knights to burst into uncontrollable weeping or sprint blindly into the woods to escape an invisible, crushing weight. Remember that paralyzing claustrophobia that gripped you before the battle, making you feel buried alive inside your iron suit? The sweating sickness replicates that exact psychological panic, but removes the armor, trapping your mind inside a rapidly heating cage of your own failing flesh. The bizarre nature of this rapid-onset nightmare has sparked endless clinical speculation. Historians still argue whether the sweating sickness was a hypervirulent hantavirus carried by camp rodents, or an early form of arbovirus spread by ticks in the damp trenches, which directly attacked the hypothalamus, the brain's internal thermostat, thereby inducing instantaneous insanity alongside physical collapse. As the fever grips you, your core temperature rises to an impossible degree. You're seized by a violent, unstoppable shaking that makes your teeth click together like iron plates, while a profuse, foul-smelling sweat drenches your bedding, turning your mattress into a warm, stagnant pool. Your mind dissolves into a violent, hyperkinetic delirium. You look around your darkened chamber, but the heavy oak furniture seems to expand and contract with a life of its own, pulsing like a monstrous heartbeat. You're convinced that you are back on the field, trapped in a burning great helm, unable to breathe the thick, suffocating air. The physician stands over you, helplessly waving a bundle of dried lavender, but you can only scream as the phantom heat burns away the remaining fabric of your sanity, leaving you spinning in a dark, frantic vortex of absolute physiological panic. The terrifying heat of the sweating sickness eventually breaks, leaving you alive but permanently scarred, only for you to face a much more common and localized madness waiting on the edge of an iron blade. Mainstream military surgeons of the late medieval period note that battlefield wounds were rarely clean. Weapons were covered in dirt, rust, and oil, meaning that even a minor scratch from a dagger could introduce lethal anaerobic bacteria into your muscle tissue. When a jagged piece of a broken poleaxe bites through the gap in your iron gauntlet, it doesn't just cut your flesh, it inoculates you with Clostridium tetani, the microscopic monster that causes lockjaw. Within days, your body begins to turn into a rigid, agonizing statue. The infection works its way up your nervous system, turning your own anatomy into an instrument of torture. A quirky fringe tidbit from historical wound logs shows that field doctors often mistook the early stages of advanced tetanus for a literal case of demonic possession, because the infection forces the facial muscles into a permanent frozen grin known as risus sardonicus. Imagine surviving a brutal shield wall encounter, only to find yourself sitting in a dark medical tent, unable to open your mouth to drink water, your lips stretched back into a grotesque, involuntary smile while your eyes wide with absolute, unmythified horror tell everyone around you that your mind is completely trapped inside a collapsing cage of bone and muscle. This physical lock has generated significant debate among modern paleopathologists. Historians still argue whether the terrifying violent muscle spasms caused by infected wounds were a primary reason why medieval field hospitals were placed far away from the main camp, to prevent the horrific, high-pitched screaming of the convulsing men from causing a total psychological breakdown among the rest of the waiting army, or if the isolation was merely a primitive attempt at quarantine. For you, the spasms are an architectural disaster. A sudden, violent convulsion snaps your spine backward with enough force to fracture your own vertebrae, your body arching off the blood-stained table like a drawn longbow. Your mind remains completely, agonizingly clear through this entire process. You're fully aware as the lack of oxygen makes your vision turn a dark, smoky grey, and you can hear the physician whispering that the foul humours have finally rotted your spirit. Remember that suffocating isolation inside your closed steel helmet where no one could hear you cry out. This is worse. You want to scream, to beg your squire to end your misery with a dagger, but your jaw is locked tight by the toxic proteins flooding your synapses. You're a silent spectator to your own agonizing physical destruction, completely frozen in a permanent smiling mask of absolute psychological torment. The rigid smiling agony of the infected camp eventually fades into the background, as you're pulled away from the front lines and thrust into the highest echelons of royal power, where an entirely different brand of madness reigns supreme. Mainstream political historians emphasize that the relentless pressures of medieval governance, combined with centuries of strategic, closed-circle intermarriage among the European aristocracy, created a dangerous breeding ground for severe inherited mental illnesses, clinical paranoia, and full-blown psychological collapse within royal courts. As a high-ranking knight sworn to protect the crown, you are forced to watch your absolute sovereign, the man who holds the divine right to rule your entire world, slowly lose his grip on reality and slide into an absolute, unpredictable abyss of delusion. The erratic behaviour of a broken monarch turns the court into a minefield of existential dread. A quirky fringe tidbit from medieval court chronicles reveals that King Charles VI of France, during his prolonged bouts of late 14th century insanity, became utterly convinced that he was made entirely of fragile glass, leading him to insert iron rods into his royal clothing, and forbid anyone from touching him, lest he shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. Remember how terrifying it felt to be trapped inside your own unyielding 50-pound suit of iron armour? Now, imagine standing guard for a man who treats his own flesh like a delicate crystal chalice, screaming in absolute terror if a servant steps too close, or if a gentle breeze rattles the stained glass windows of the throne room. This top-down psychological decay has fueled decades of intense debate among modern political analysts. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in the madness of kings was occasionally weaponized by ambitious dukes to legally usurp royal authority through regency councils, or if the sheer, unmitigated pressure of holding absolute power during times of catastrophic plague and endless warfare simply broke the fragile neural pathways of these inbred rulers. For you, the king's delusion demands an exhausting, hyper-vigilant performance. You must stand completely motionless for hours, holding your breath, because a sudden metallic clink from your iron greaves could trigger a violent panic attack in your sovereign, causing him to sprint through the castle corridors in a state of absolute screaming hysteria. The royal court transforms from a centre of civilization into a surreal theatre of the absurd. You watch as advisors nod solemnly to commands issued to imaginary saints, and you are forced to nod along as well, your own mind fracturing under the strain of pretending that the universe is perfectly sane. The paranoia from the top drips down like grease on a roasting spit, infecting every duke, count, and captain in the room. You find yourself constantly glancing over your shoulder, looking for poisoners in the kitchens and assassins in the chapel, fully aware that when the man at the very top of the feudal pyramid goes completely insane, the entire social order begins to crack, dragging everyone down into a dark, volatile spiral of collective political madness. The psychological decay of the royal court eventually fractures into open rebellion, and you find yourself pulled away from the fragile king only to be trapped inside the grim, claustrophobic nightmare of a prolonged castle siege. Mainstream military historians point out that medieval sieges were agonizing endurance contests, where the psychological toll far outweighed the physical combat, turning stone strongholds into massive open-air pressure cookers. As the months drag on, the enemy cuts off all supply lines, forcing the garrison to consume their horses, then the castle hounds, and finally the rats scurrying through the lower cellars. You're trapped behind 12 feet of solid stone, watching the men around you waste away into hollow-eyed ghosts, while the air inside the courtyard grows thick with the stench of open latrines and rotting teeth. The tactical desperation of the besieging army introduces a horrific psychological weapon to the conflict. A quirky, fringe tidbit from medieval siege accounts reveals that attacking forces would regularly use massive trebuchets to catapult the rotting, bloated carcasses of dead horses, diseased prisoners, and even severed heads of captured soldiers directly over the castle walls. Imagine sitting in your iron armour beneath a stone archway, only to hear a sickening wet thud as a decomposed horse explodes on the cobblestones 50 feet away, spraying a toxic slurry of putrid fluids and thousands of buzzing flies across your clean uniform. The sheer horror of this biological warfare turns the castle into a waking nightmare, where every breath you draw feels like inhaling a lethal poison. This unrelenting sensory assault has sparked intense debate among modern military psychologists. Historians still argue whether the extreme trauma of a prolonged siege caused a distinct form of collective psychosis that made garrisons turn on their own commanders in desperate homicidal fits, or if the sheer physical deprivation simply reduced these battle-hardened knights to an animalistic state where survival instincts entirely overrode their oaths of chivalry. In your case, the constant fear of disease and starvation turns the stone walls into a private prison. You look at the massive ramparts that once made you feel safe, and you realize they are just a larger version of your closed iron helmet, a beautiful engineered structure that is slowly suffocating you to death. Your mind begins to play cruel tricks on you in the dead of night. You stand watch on the high battlements, listening to the distant, mocking campfires of the enemy army, and you find yourself imagining the taste of fresh water and roasted venison until your mouth aches with a physical pain. Every shadow moving in the valley below looks like a massive siege tower rolling toward the gates, and every rustle of the wind sounds like the stealthy approach of a traitor coming to slit your throat for a scrap of salt pork. The castle has ceased to be a glorious bastion of your lord's power. It has become a cold stone tomb where the slow, systematic grinding of starvation and psychological terror slowly unravels your sanity, leaving you waiting for the final bloody assault that will either grant you a quick death or doom you to absolute madness. The agonizing months of the siege finally break when the castle gates are smashed open, but your survival brings no relief. You are immediately swept into the ultimate chaotic culmination of medieval military horror, the shield wall. Mainstream tactical historians describe the high medieval infantry clash as an experience of unimaginable physical compression, where hundreds of men are jammed together so tightly that individual martial skill becomes completely irrelevant. You are locked chest to chest with the men around you, your heavy iron shields overlapping to form a continuous barrier of wood and steel. The physical pressure from behind is immense as hundreds of screaming soldiers press forward, forcing you directly into the bristling wall of enemy spears with the unstoppable momentum of a human landslide. Inside this suffocating human vice, the psychological terror shifts from isolation to absolute, crushing claustrophobia. A quirky, fringe tidbit from historical reenactment and experimental archaeology trials shows that the sheer kinetic force generated by two colliding shield walls could easily exceed several tons of pressure, effectively fracturing the ribs of the men in the front ranks through their armour and causing traumatic asphyxiation, where a soldier simply suffocates to death while standing perfectly upright, completely unable to expand their lungs to draw air because of the immense weight pressing against their chest plates. Imagine being trampled while still on your feet, your arms pinned flat against your sides, watching a jagged dagger slowly move toward your exposed throat while you are physically powerless to lift your hand to parry the blow. This extreme physical compression has fueled deep academic analysis regarding battlefield psychology. Historians still argue whether the tight claustrophobic structure of the shield wall acted as a powerful psychological anchor that prevented terrified men from fleeing the field through peer pressure, or if it simply triggered a state of collective animalistic panic where individual consciousness dissolved completely, leaving nothing but a wall of screaming, hyper-violent automatons driven by raw survival instincts. For you, the compression is absolute. The heat inside your helmet skyrockets once again as the breath of the enemy sprays directly through your visor slits, hot and smelling of stale ale and rotting gums. Your ribs ache with a dull, sickening crack as the pressure intensifies, and the world narrows down to a tiny, frantic space between your shield boss and the face of the man trying to murder you. You can hear the horrific, wet crunch of bone breaking just inches away, but you cannot turn your head to see who has fallen. The noise is a deafening, continuous roar of splintering wood, grinding iron, and high-pitched screams that fills your skull until your thoughts shatter completely. You're no longer a knight, a noble, or a servant of God. You're merely a single, terrified cell in a massive, bleeding monster of iron and flesh, gasping for a single lungful of air as the wall pushes you deeper into the mouth of hell. The bone-crushing pressure of the shield wall eventually fractures, but as you tumble out of the human vice and look across the field, you realize the environment itself has turned into a lethal psychological trap. Mainstream landscape historians emphasize that late medieval battles, such as Agincourt in 1415 or Towton in 1461, were profoundly shaped by catastrophic weather and terrain, transforming the glorious field of honor into an inescapable swamp of liquid clay, horseblood, and severed limbs. Clad in your 50 pounds of specialized steel armor, you are perfectly engineered to resist a sword blow, but you are catastrophically top-heavy and utterly helpless against the laws of gravity when the very earth dissolves beneath your iron boots. The physical mechanics of this muddy trap introduce a horrific, highly specific form of battlefield casualty. A quirky, fringe tidbit from forensic archaeology studies of medieval mass graves reveals that a significant number of fully armoured knights didn't die from fatal weapon wounds. Instead, they suffered from positional asphyxiation, or literal drowning in shallow mud. When an armoured warrior slipped or was knocked flat onto their back in a deep wet ditch, the weight of the plates combined with the suction of the clay made it physically impossible to stand up without assistance. Imagine laying pinned beneath the weight of your own expensive gear, looking up at the sky through a tiny visor slit, while the rising tide of liquid mud slowly flows inside your helmet, filling your nose and mouth while your comrades step directly onto your face to keep themselves from falling. This terrifying environmental helplessness has sparked intense discussion among modern military historians. Historians still argue whether the extreme, unprovoked brutality observed in the late stages of medieval battles, where infantrymen would systematically execute helpless, mud-trapped nobles rather than capturing them for a lucrative ransom, was driven by raw class hatred, or if the sheer, frantic terror of being sucked down into the earth themselves triggered a collective primal urge to eliminate anything that threatened to drag them under. For you, the earth is actively pulling you down. Every step requires a monumental, muscle-tearing effort as the thick mud clings to your iron greaves like wet cement, draining your remaining physical energy within minutes. Your vision narrows as exhaustion takes a tight hold of your lungs. You watch as a beautifully caparisoned warhorse plunges into the mire nearby, its massive iron-shod hooves flailing wildly in a blind panic, spraying dark mud across your visor and completely blinding you. The world turns pitch black inside your steel bucket. You can hear the wet, heavy sloshing of the swamp all around you, and you live in absolute terror of the next step, terrified that you will stumble into a hidden ditch and become a permanent iron-plated monument buried alive in a nameless, suffocating bog. The heavy mud of the battlefield slowly dries, but your survival only guarantees your entry into an even more intimate, terrifying arena of psychological horror, the judicial duel. Mainstream legal and social historians point out that the medieval legal system frequently relied on trial by combat, or trial by ordeal, a formal process based on the absolute psychological certainty that God would personally intervene on the battlefield to grant victory to the righteous party, regardless of physical strength or skill. If an aging, traumatized knight was accused of treason or a property dispute by a wealthy rival, he couldn't rely on a clever lawyer. He was forced to step into a small, enclosed wooden ring called the lists, knowing that if he lost, it wasn't just a legal defeat. It was proof that the Almighty had personally judged him a liar and a sinner. The extreme mental isolation of this legal theatre shifts the psychological burden directly onto your raw nerves. A quirky fringe tidbit from historical combat manuals such as the Flos Duellatorum by Masterfiore de Liberi, notes that judicial duels were fought under highly specific, claustrophobic rules where the combatants were strictly forbidden from speaking, using magical amulets, or receiving any assistance from their squires once the gates were locked. Remember that profound, ringing silence inside your iron helmet from the vanguard charge? Multiply that tenfold as you stand inside a tiny wooden box surrounded by thousands of silent watching citizens, your heart hammering against your ribs because you realize that if you slip on a patch of wet grass, the crowd will celebrate your death as an act of divine justice. This absolute spiritual pressure has fueled intense investigation among modern legal historians. Historians still argue whether the intense psychological terror of the judicial duel was deliberately designed by the church to force nervous litigants into out-of-court settlements before entering the ring, or if the process acted as a powerful social safety valve that replaced chaotic, multi-generational family blood feuds with a single, highly contained burst of legally sanctioned violence. For you, the spiritual dread is overwhelming. You look across the small ring at your opponent, a fresh, unarmoured mercenary hired by your accuser, and your hand trembles violently on your sword hilt. You are a seasoned warrior, yet you are completely paralysed by the terrifying thought that your past battlefield sins have finally caught up with you. Your vision narrows down to that same horizontal visor slit as your opponent begins his advance, his steel dagger gleaming in the sharp sunlight. The crowd fades into a distant, muffled roar that sounds exactly like the crashing waves of the shield wall. Your muscles, stiffened by years of heavy armour and toxic mercury exposure, refuse to move with their usual fluid precision. You realise with absolute certainty that this ring is not a place of law or honour. It is a clinical, highly orchestrated psychological execution chamber where the heavy, suffocating weight of your own guilt will drag you down to the earth long before the enemy blade ever finds a gap in your iron armour. The terrifying verdict of the judicial ring is avoided only because a sudden midnight alarm rips through the camp, thrusting you into the absolute apex of medieval asymmetric warfare, the tactical night raid, or the chevauchée. Mainstream military historians emphasize that the high medieval period increasingly relied on these brutal, fast-moving night incursions designed to burn crops, slaughter livestock, and utterly destroy the economic spine of an enemy territory. For a heavily armoured knight, a night raid flips the entire concept of warfare on its head. Honour is completely abandoned. You're ordered to strip off your heavy, clanking iron greaves to move quietly through the pitch blackness, launching a sudden, hyper-violent assault on an unsuspecting sleeping outpost or a defenceless farming village. Inside this ink-black theatre of war, your sensory reality fractures completely. A quirky, fringe tidbit from 15th century tactical notebooks reveals that during night operations, knights would often grease the articulated hinges of their iron breastplates with lard or animal fat to prevent the metallic squeaking that would instantly give away their position in the dead silence of the forest. Imagine moving through a thick, tangled thicket in the dead of winter, the smell of rancid pork fat radiating off your hot iron plates, while you try to breathe quietly through your nose. The sensory isolation is absolute. Without torches, your horizontal visor slit becomes a useless strip of black leather, forcing you to navigate entirely by the crunch of twigs beneath your boots and the terrified, rhythmic breathing of the man moving right beside you. This terrifying lack of visibility has sparked intense debate among modern tactical analysts. Historians still argue whether the extreme, indiscriminate slaughter associated with medieval night raids was a deliberate psychological strategy meant to break the enemy's civilian morale, or if it was simply the inevitable result of hyper-vigilant, terrified soldiers operating in total darkness, where the absolute inability to distinguish a surrender gesture from an incoming axe blow caused them to reflexively murder every living thing that crossed their path. For you, the darkness is a physical threat. A sudden, blinding flash of light erupts as a comrade throws a torch onto a thatched roof, and the sudden glare catches your unadjusted eyes, burning your retinas and throwing monstrous dancing shadows across the wooden walls. Your nervous system snaps into a state of wild, uncontrollable panic. The quiet night explodes into a deafening cacophony of screaming livestock, shrieking children, and the wet, heavy thud of iron weapons meeting soft flesh. You find yourself swinging your short sword wildly into the dark corners of a smoky hovel, unable to see if you're striking an armed guardsman or a terrified peasant huddled beneath a pile of straw. The thick, sweet smell of fresh blood mixes with the acrid, suffocating smoke of the burning thatch, filling your helmet until you are gasping and coughing for air. You're no longer a proud protector of the weak. You are an invisible, faceless agent of absolute terror, trapped in a chaotic, fiery nightmare where the rules of civilization have been utterly incinerated, leaving nothing but the raw, animalistic impulse to kill everything in the dark before the dark kills you. The fiery chaos of the night raid eventually burns itself out, but your survival lands you in the final, most enduring psychological prison of the medieval world, the reality of high-status captivity and the agonizing wait for a ransom. Mainstream economic and social historians point out that for a wealthy knight, a battlefield defeat rarely meant immediate death. Instead, it marked the beginning of a cold, transactional incarceration. Because your armor and lineage signal immense wealth, you're a valuable commodity, a living check waiting to be cashed. You're stripped of your weapon, separated from your loyal squires, and locked away in the high tower of an enemy stronghold, transformed from a proud, active instrument of your lord's will into a passive, sitting investment. The psychological torture of this aristocratic hostage scenario lies in its profound, open-ended isolation. A quirky, fringe tidbit from medieval legal and financial registries reveals that the process of negotiating a knight's ransom could drag on for years, often bankrupting the prisoner's entire extended family, who had to sell off ancestral lands, livestock, and even church silver just to meet the exorbitant demands. Remember that suffocating, tight confinement inside your iron helmet, where you couldn't see the world around you. Now, you experience that same crushing containment on a macro scale. You spend your days pacing a small stone cell, watching the seasons change through a narrow arrow slit, fully aware that every day you sit in silence is another day your family creeps closer to absolute financial ruin. This lingering, stagnant state of limbo has sparked intense discussion among modern historians of medieval law. Historians still argue whether the elaborate courtesy shown to high-ranking prisoners of war, who were often allowed to dine at the captor's table and participate in local hunts, was a genuine reflection of shared chivalric brotherhood, or if it was a highly calculated psychological strategy designed to keep the hostage compliant and prevent them from attempting a desperate escape that would void the massive payout. For you, the courtesy feels like a slow execution. You sit at your captor's table wearing a borrowed doublet, forced to smile and raise a goblet of wine with the very men who slaughtered your vanguard and broke your shield wall. Your mind becomes your own worst enemy in this gilded cage. Without the non-stop adrenaline of the march or the rigid discipline of the camp, the long-repressed ghosts of your military career come flooding back into the silence. You can hear the rhythmic, distant pacing of the guard outside your heavy oak door, and the sound matches the steady, anxious throb of your own pulse. The financial guilt weighs heavier on your chest than your 50-pound breastplate ever did. You find yourself staring at the cold stone floor for hours, calculating the cost of your own life in silver marks, completely untethered from the world of action and honour, left to slowly unravel in a quiet, high-altitude purgatory where your sanity is systematically ground down by the agonizingly slow passage of unredeemed time. The agonizing stillness of the ransom tower finally breaks when the final silver marks are paid, but your return home offers no peaceful retirement. You're immediately summoned by your suzerain to lead the final, catastrophic phase of medieval warfare, the total scorched earth retreat. Mainstream military and environmental historians emphasize that when a medieval army was forced into a strategic withdrawal across hostile territory, they did not simply march away. To prevent the pursuing enemy from utilizing local infrastructure, retreating forces executed a systematic policy of total destruction, burning every mill, poisoning every well with animal carcasses, and destroying entire agricultural valleys to create an artificial desert behind them. Inside this travelling wasteland, the psychological toll shifts from individual survival to the crushing weight of collective complicity. A quirky, fringe tidbit from 14th century tactical diaries reveals that to ensure maximum devastation, retreating knights were ordered to systematically slaughter all local beasts of burden, oxen, mules, and plough horses, by severing their hamstrings, leaving thousands of agonizingly crippled animals screaming in the fields to choke the air with the sounds of industrial-scale slaughter. Remember that horrific, deafening roar of splintering wood and dying horses inside the shield wall? Now, Multiply that sensory assault as you ride through a silent, smoking valley where the only sound is the rhythmic, agonizing screech of mutilated livestock echoing off the blackened hills. This deliberate creation of ecological voids has fueled intense debate among modern ethics historians. Historians still argue whether the extreme, indiscriminate destruction of the scorched earth policy was a cold, rational necessity dictated by the absolute lack of logistical supply lines in the medieval period, or if it was a form of collective military psychosis, a desperate, scorched earth venting of rage by a defeated army that looked to punish the very earth itself for their strategic failures. For you, the smoke is a physical barrier. The thick, acrid haze from thousands of burning wheat fields hangs low over the damp roads, creeping inside your visor slits and coating your throat with a bitter, oily film of ash that makes every breath an agonizing struggle. Your vision narrows down to that same horizontal slit as you lead your vanguard through the ruins of a village you were sworn to protect just months prior. The line between friend and foe is completely evaporated in the ash-choked air. You watch as your own squires toss torches into the thatch of a communal granary, their faces blackened by soot until they look less like men and more like the grotesque metallic demons from your ergot-induced nightmares. The world has turned completely monochrome, a bleak, grey landscape of ash and bone where the concepts of chivalry, honour, and holy justice are utterly consumed by the flames, leaving your mind to wander aimlessly through a smoking, silent purgatory of your own making. The ash-choked trails of the scorched retreat lead you straight to the sea, where you're crammed onto an auxiliary cog for the journey home, only to encounter the absolute pinnacle of medieval nautical horror, the deep-water naval battle. Mainstream maritime historians emphasize that medieval naval warfare was not a tactical duel of maneuvering ships, but rather a series of brutal floating siege actions. Cogs, clunky high-walled merchant vessels, were packed with hundreds of fully armoured knights and archers. When two opposing fleets collided, the ships were chained together with iron grappling hooks, transforming the unstable, pitching wooden decks into a chaotic floating slaughterhouse, where there was absolutely no room for retreat. Inside this floating fortress, your specialised plate armour turns from a status symbol into an absolute death sentence. A quirky fringe tidbit from medieval naval accounts, such as records of the Battle of Sluys in 1400, reveals that the most terrifying weapon on the water was not the longbow, but massive stones, iron bars, and pots of boiling pitch launched from the fighting tops, the small wooden towers built high up on the ship's masts. Imagine standing on a deck slick with sea spray, pig fat, and fresh blood, your heavy iron sabatons sliding out from under you, while 50-pound rocks crash through the timbers, splintering the oak decks and instantly crushing the legs of the men trapped below. This extreme, concentrated violence on the high seas has fueled intense debate among modern naval archaeologists. Historians still argue whether the staggering casualty rates in medieval naval clashes, where entire armies vanished into the waves in a single afternoon, were primarily caused by weapon wounds, or if the sheer, frantic terror of capsizing while locked inside 50 pounds of airtight steel triggered a collective blind panic that caused men to trample each other to reach the few small skiffs. For you, the ocean is an insatiable monster. The rhythmic, heavy groaning of the ship's timbers matches the anxious throb of your own pulse, and every time a wave hits the hull you feel the terrifying weight of your armour pulling your centre of gravity toward the dark water. Your vision narrows down to that familiar horizontal visor slit as a stray pot of burning pitch explodes on the forecastle, filling the damp air with a thick, suffocating black smoke that blinds you completely. The noise is a deafening, chaotic roar of snapping ropes, crashing hulls, and the high-pitched screams of drowning men locked inside their iron shells below deck. You are trapped on a spinning, burning island of wood and steel, completely isolated from the land, fully aware that if the ship rolls just a few degrees too far, the cold ocean will rush into your helmet, burying you alive in a dark, watery grave at the bottom of the world.